Now, how this translates into why Bitcoin's number is going to go up is because if I just imagine a room, let's say of like 1,000 people who all have this wealth that they need to store into a battery, they're not only asking what's the best battery for me, they're asking what's the best battery for everyone else,
Yeah.
which is the first time we ever just defaulted on debt on a global scale as a country. No one ever thought we would do that, and we just did it. So now all the kids on the playground are like, wait a second, if the whole world comes back and says, I want my gold in exchange for my dollars, the US can do that. So in the case of them backing with Bitcoin, how many Bitcoin, at the current value of Bitcoin, would they need to be able to back all of the dollars in existence in the system? Dude, it's 1.67 billion Bitcoin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Bitcoin discussion. I have a good friend of mine and a wonderful guest today, Jake Oswald. Jake Oswald is the vice president of the nonprofit 501c3 organization Bitcoin is Better. And I'm pretty sure today we have a very bullish Bitcoin discussion as far as Bitcoin, number go up, future purchasing power, all of those things. And more importantly, why none of that actually matters. Because Bitcoin is not just about getting richer, but as importantly, if not more importantly, it's about preserving your purchasing power, and it's an insurance policy on the fiat world, the world-changing order, and everything else that's going on. People can feel it, but in this video today, we're going to break down how exactly that's happening, and then more specifically, what you need to do as soon as possible to protect your wealth. So, Jake, thank you for joining. It's awesome to have you here. I know you don't typically do a lot of these podcasts, but I'm glad I was able to get you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This will be a fun one for me.
Yeah. Great. So what is your background, briefly?
By trade, by day, I work as a data guy at a company called Servant. We build techie stuff like websites and mobile apps for Christian nonprofits like The Chosen and the YouVersion Bible app, if you're familiar with those companies. But by night, I love Bitcoin. I love learning about it and talking about it and helping my friends and family to understand it.
Yeah, great. So you're a data guy. You're in all the charts and you do lots of stuff that I'm sure
That's right.
most people, including myself, would kind of roll their eyes over with. So, what would you explain from a higher level? Why is Bitcoin better? And then we'll get down more specifics of the data points in the world you see that are not looking so great. So, Jake, why is Bitcoin better? Like, what is the pre-context to even beginning to understand why Bitcoin supplants as an insurance policy on the fiat clown world? Why is Bitcoin have any chance or hope of being the solution to that?
Good question. Well, I might start with my dad's an Angus cattle farmer. Got a big ranch of cows, and all of our neighbors and family friends, they're all common sense people from small town Iowa. One of the things you hear people say all the time is how valuable land is. Everyone talks about land. They want to own it, and they always say, God ain't making any more of it. They understand intuitively why scarcity is important, and none of them feel like they can say the same thing about the US dollar. I don't think any of them could articulate the mechanics of why that's happening, but they know that it is. And there's this weird divide where Bitcoin doesn't yet feel like the solution to them, but they're very aware of the problem and the nature of the problem. So Bitcoin is better because we ain't making any more of it. And so it's going to be a good story of your value, just like land is for the common sense farmer.
Right, right. Now, what is the difference though? Because if I just made a token, right? If I just made 1,000,000 loot coins and I gave them out to people, and I could claim that I'm not making any more, why is it that Bitcoin is different from that, right? Obviously,
Great question.
yeah, obviously the dollar, we all get it. It's worth less. Everything's more expensive. Food, energy, housing, everything, right? But
Right.
they're not making that much more, right? But like Bitcoins,
Right.
can't somebody just 10x the number of them?
Right. Exactly. This is another reason why land is a great analogy. Um, like another, doggy coin or something, we can always produce more of those things, or in theory, those things have rules we can change. I can't go out and make a bunch more land easily. Almost not at all, right? Without infilling a bunch of the ocean or something. That's extremely expensive. So it's very difficult to make more of. That's different than the definition of scarcity, meaning there's not very much of something. More specifically, meaning It's very hard to make more of the thing there's already not that much of.
Right. Yeah. So it's not just the current scarcity, it's also about humans' ability to predict future scarcity of
Correct.
that item. Okay, great. So,
Right.
so with that foundation laid out, for people watching, they're both new to Bitcoin and have been in Bitcoin a while. With that assumption that we're assuming Bitcoin is really, really scarce, and we're assuming that Bitcoin is going to remain scarce in the future, which of course we could spend hours talking about why those are. But with those established, now, Jake, what is the argument for why Bitcoin could go up? Why Bitcoin could be more valuable, right? Because obviously supply and demand, right? But to what extent will people demand that, right? Like, does everybody need that, right? Not everybody needs a cattle ranch. Not everybody needs lakefront property, right? So, likewise,
Hmm.
why will everybody, or at least a lot of people, need this form of digital scarcity, right?
Okay. Another great question. I think that people discount or don't even realize the necessity for a store of value as like a basic human need. The necessity for a store of value, basic human need, like bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I need water, I need shelter, I need food, and I need something that I can store my life force with, right? Converting my time and energy into wealth and saving it for a rainy day. And that's because we all know that life is unpredictable, that bad things happen in the future. I don't know what's coming. So if I have a safety net saved now, I'm protecting myself from that unknown event in the future. I need something that will store my present time energy well so that I'm protected from that future event. If I don't have a good store of value, in the future I show up, the 100-year storm hits, and what I made before has all evaporated away, and I'm totally vulnerable to that event. So store of value is a basic human need. Now, why does that mean that Bitcoin's value is going up exponentially? I think that I'm going to keep coming back to land. This is helpful to me, and I think it's helpful to the people in my world. Forever ago, in the U.S., we had what was called the Homestead Act. Luke, you and I have talked about this before. Basically, what happened is the government bought basically the whole country from other countries, and then they gave that land away to anyone who wanted to become a citizen. All you had to do was farm it. At that time, that land was, I mean, it was so cheap, it was almost virtually free because there was so much of it. It was not actually, you know, we can mince meat about how we're defining scarcity, but there was lots of it, and its valuation was primarily a derivative of its productivity. Its valuation didn't have much to do yet with it serving as a store of value because there was so much of it left elsewhere. Does that make sense? So if I could make $1,000 in um, harvesting corn on that chunk of land next year, that's what creates the valuation of that land. And if I can suddenly produce $10,000 worth of corn on that land, now the land is worth more. But over time, now that everybody owns that land, its valuation is going up beyond its productivity value. Now it's serving as a store of value because humans' basic need, we need places to store value. So we look for the thing that's the most scarce to do that well. So enter stage right Bitcoin. It's an even better store of value, even more scarce than land. And, we can talk about the reasons why it's a better store of value. And it's starting to eat that monetary premium away from everything that's done it for us for the last, hundreds and thousands of years. So maybe that's a bit pie in the sky, but it's a tailwind. Everything's converting into that new, better form of store of value. The monetary premium getting sucked out of the other stuff.
It's almost
Nodding your head along. How
it,
would you describe that?
well, yeah. I'm thinking it through as you're talking. It's almost as if all monetary premium and all stores of value are proxy forms of insurance, right? Like if I just think at first principles, we're in the world 5,000 years ago, and nobody needs Bitcoin, nobody needs gold, everybody needs food because 5% of the population starves or whatever, right? Like food, salt, wheat, cows. These are the forms of money of the ancient world thousands of years ago, and
Right.
the people that are rich in that ancient world are the people, the warlords, the tribe chiefs, whatever, in charge of small regions, city states or whatever, and they're rich because they have all the excess food. But anyway, I guess my point is that throughout all of history up to this point, like all wealth basically if you're an optimist, you think, oh, they're so wealthy, like they're rich. But if you think from a pessimistic frame, it's like they're rich because they have the most downside protection, right? They have the biggest
Exactly.
fat storage, right?
Yes. Yeah, they survive the storm when no one else does.
Right. Right. So yeah, it's like all of wealth is pricing how what is your ability to survive the storm. So the person with more food 5,000 years ago is considered richer. The person with more gold 3,000 years ago is considered richer because they can turn that gold back into food and then consume the food. And
Hmm.
likewise, the person today with the most Apple stock, Amazon stock, rental portfolio, or government bonds, whatever, the person today with the most economic numbers that are under their name, their legal status, the longest they're able to weather the storm, essentially.
Right. And their job, like if we imagine that we're Abraham with all the flocks, we own half the world's wealth and resources. Our job is to try to discern which asset classes are the best store of value and hold those things. If sheep die every day, as soon as the sun goes up, they overheat and die. It's probably a bad asset class to hold my wealth in, right? So I'm
Right.
looking for the best battery. Now, how this translates into why Bitcoin's number is going to go up is because if I just imagine a room, let's say of like 1,000 people who all have this wealth that they need to store into a battery, they're not only asking what's the best battery for me, they're asking what's the best battery for everyone else.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like this musical chairs moment. We're all looking around to see if everybody else thinks sheep is the best. Like it's important that I do, but it's even more important if everyone else does.
Right.
And then you have that sort of like escape velocity where things just like gravity just everyone sucks into that new asset class.
Right.
So like everybody who's a traditional financier, like my dad, he's been in banking for years. He's a big cattleman. He understands finance well. Anybody in that world, even if they don't know Bitcoin, would tell you that there's a big, fat, juicy monetary premium on stocks. Their valuation is 10x, 20x, 50x the traditional valuation of that stock, according to how much it should be, based on merely its cash flow productivity as a business. And that's all that monetary premium stacking up on top of that thing. And now suddenly there's something else in the world. It's better than sheep. It's a better store of value than the stock. So all of that value is likely to pour it over here to this other thing.
Yeah.
So I want to be here before everyone else does. That's the tailwind.
Yeah, because I think I think that's probably the reason why we forget that, right? I think in our modern world, people get caught up with the numbers, right? I mean, people compare numbers with everything, right? They compare who has the higher net worth, who has the bigger car, who has more or less miles on their car, who has the house with the biggest price, or the biggest square footage, or the cheapest interest rate. Even with our health, right? Like, okay, count your calories, count your steps, compare your steps and calories to each other. How many miles did you bike today, right? It's like I think because we've developed society so much and we're so obsessed with these numbers, we keep forgetting that fundamental principle that all of those metrics, all of them, come down to who can survive the longest, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can do a marathon and I can't, or you can run, half a kilometer longer than me, or you can run an 8-minute mile and I run a 9-minute mile or whatever. It's like all of those also come back to health. You having a bigger house comes back to showing the world that I was successful, I could contribute to the marketplace, and I've got a bigger house or whatever. And so, anyway, I think perhaps the success of human society over the last few thousand years and the exponential rate of technology has maybe contributed in us forgetting that baseline need, because then, of course, the problem that arises is that what is the most critical asset to own or to consume, let's say, in the world? Oxygen, right? More important than anything, more important than your house, more important than your car, more important than your more important than everything else in your world. Food, heat, shelter. Oxygen is the most important one, but the problem is that you can't save an oxygen, right? It's like if I bottled up oxygen and I went to my neighbor and I tried to sell it to him for $50, it's like he's gonna laugh at me, right? He's gonna laugh at me, call me a scammer. It's like it doesn't make any sense. And so I think the funny thing is that as society has developed in the last 5,000 years, and we have turned more things into oxygen, quote unquote, meaning we have turned cows from being scarce to cows being abundant, right? We have turned water from being scarce to water being abundant, from shelter being scarce to shelter being more abundant. And so, like, as we turn more things into oxygen and we oxygenify or whatever the baseline survival commodities of the world, we inherently have to transition towards
Yes.
some scarce abstraction of a percentage of all the things we produce. And so it's like this irony, I think, that the more
Yes.
successful we are, the less we have the scarcity of baseline commodities. The more successful we are, the more we rely on these numbers to represent the commodities, and therefore we forget that the only reason the numbers have value in the first place is that we built and distributed more commodities. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yes. Complete sense. Let me reiterate for
Yeah.
you, just for the listener.
It's like an irony. It's like a self-fulfilling
It is.
paradox.
Yes. Early in the world's history, everything was more scarce, and we needed scarce things to store our wealth with, so it worked fairly well. But as the world has advanced, the things that used to be scarce are no longer that as scarce, and they're decreasingly less scarce. Like you're saying, we build more houses, we're raising more cows, we're producing more corn with the same amount of land, right? So I can't, even though I still need the store of value, the things that I've been depending on to do that with are working less and less well, including the US dollar. There's more of that now than there ever has been.
Right. So you mentioned Abraham earlier. You and I are both Christians. We'll probably talk about that later in the show, more in depth. But I think the economic lesson, even let's say from the Old Testament, is that right? Is that Solomon was the richest man in the world when he was alive, right? King of Israel. David and Abraham and many of the historical figures in the prophets in the Old Testament were very rich. But to your point, and to this whole discussion, I think it's like, I don't know how many people that watch this are watching this show right now have actually like read those books and have read the Bible and specifically that, but the Bible at times is very specific with how much gold country A paid country B, or how many cattle this person had, or this and that the other, right? It's like, if you read early Genesis, like, it would describe the wealth of Abraham by having male and female donkeys, right? It's like it's funny to me to think about how these men would have been the top 10 richest people in the world, right? All of them, probably. And now, if an average human farmer has, a few dozen or a few hundred of any form of livestock, they're rich, and they're probably richer than the average person, but, the number, they've been demoted from the top 0.001% down to maybe the top 5%, or top
Mm-hmm.
10%, or I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting to think of it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I
So
want to tell a brief story
yeah, go
about
ahead.
this tailwind thing before we move on to the next topic. There's so many like theoretical conversations about Bitcoin. Sometimes that can be unhelpful, and it's a more practical real life story is helpful. So I got into Bitcoin 2020, 2021 in that bull market phase. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand the technology. And by the time I got there, I was already all about real estate. Every young man, I'm 30 now, anyone who's in their early to mid 20s is trying to figure out, I got to buy a house, I got to buy a duplex. I got to get in the grind because they know if they don't, they'll fall behind. So everybody's listening to Bigger Pockets and the whole nine, right? And there's all these reasons why buying real estate makes a lot of sense. While I was going through that process, buying the duplex, my buddy Carl and I bought it together. My dad was this voice of reason. He was always saying, like, slow down, buddy. It's not going to solve all your life's problems. It's not going to make you a millionaire. It's going to suck. And I didn't appreciate that until I got into it. And now, like, just this last week, we had a sink that one of the tenants dropped, a razor blade down in the P trap, and it went all the way back in the wall. We got to replace all of that now. It's going to probably be over $1,000 to repair that. We're redoing the roof from a bunch of hail damage. There's another $2,000 in insurance. Um, I could give you a long list of every year. There's 12 things that go wrong, and add on top of that all the taxes we pay at every turn to buy it, to hold it, to sell it. It's like I never appreciated just how hard it is to hold real estate. But the reason why I did it in the first place was because I knew intuitively I need a store of value. or I'm going to wake up someday and not be able to retire, even when I'm 70 and exhausted, you know? But now that I'm here and I'm experiencing like or I should say like the cons of owning real estate, and I understand Bitcoin, oh man. Like if I need to store value, I don't have to fix a sink for Bitcoin. I don't have to pay taxes on it every year. The list is a long list of things that I don't have to worry about anymore with Bitcoin. And I'm looking around in the room of 1,000 young men and everyone else is experiencing this. I would way rather own this thing that's a way lower maintenance battery, and everyone else is starting to experience that. All these young men, like I don't think they're listening to Bigger Pockets anymore like they used to, 8 years ago, after the real estate craze. Bitcoin is just a better option for everyone, and that tailwind is going to continue because of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they've found Bitcoin yet. I mean, just I don't think there's that many people in Bitcoin. I mean,
Mm.
I don't know how many people follow Bigger Pockets, but I think it's like hundreds of thousands, right? And
Oh yeah, it's for sure. I'm
yeah,
just saying, like within my circles, it used to be I couldn't go to dinner anywhere without that being 3/4 of the conversation, and that's not the case anymore at all.
yeah, yeah. I mean, really, like,
Maybe that's just because I'm
mhm.
too old now or something. But
Yeah, really, a lot of it I think is the difficulties that really you're buying a business, and I think that's really what all of these things are, right? When people are buying real estate, really they're buying a business, they're buying a rental business. When people are buying stocks in the S&P 500, they're buying a business. And I think this gets back to the whole true wealth in this world is how able are you to weather the storm? What is your insurance on life? Like how long will you survive not doing any work or not doing work profitably and you'll be able to not starve, right? But then the numbers, as we can't as we increasingly can't trust the dollar to continue its
Mhm.
scarcity. We increasingly can't trust commodities to retain their scarcity because we're getting better technologically. And so then the only thing we know to do is to buy a business that will
Mhm.
forever retain more dollars and forever produce more commodities. And so then everyone just defaults towards buying stocks and buying real estate because those things are
Mhm.
relatively dependable businesses. They're the biggest publicly listed companies in the world, and real estate, housing, is a business that um, probably is diluted the slowest compared to all the other businesses in the world, especially
Right.
software. So, to me, when I hear you say that, that's predominantly what I hear is that most people, and this is the thing with intrinsic value that it just racks my brain is that these people say, oh, this or that doesn't have intrinsic value, but the reality is that none of this has intrinsic value, right? It's like maybe you could say your numerical system has intrinsic value, but if all of a sudden, you know, half the world was short on water, I mean, all of a sudden water is the only thing that's valuable anymore. Like everything else collapses
Mhm.
against water. And so maybe that's how it comes to Bitcoin is that I think what you and I would argue is that Bitcoin is the better index fund for the world than the stock market, right? And so I'm assuming you would agree with that.
Yeah. Well
If
said.
you, if you want to
Well said.
elaborate, because I think really what we're getting at here is that the reason Bitcoin could become worth $1 million, $10 million or more is because Bitcoin is the index fund of the world, but it's a more accurate index fund than stocks, right? Like people would value gold in the past because you could exchange it for food better than
Mhm.
holding the food itself. And then now, likewise with stocks, you can exchange the stocks for food or housing better than holding on to the food itself, right? You wouldn't store up 1,000 ribeyes for your retirement in 40 years, but you would store up enough stocks to buy you 1,000 ribeyes in 40 years or whenever you retired, right? And so if it so anyway, I'm kind of just thinking out loud here, but to me that seems to be really the bullish case for Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is that insurance policy on protecting people in the future. And because it's more liquid, because it's more universal than the S&P 500 or any local piece of real estate, then it should just eat more and more of that monetary premium. What would be
Right.
your elaboration, or what would be a different frame on what I'm saying?
I think one of the things I've loved about Bitcoin as I've just sort of like burrowed down the rabbit hole, as we all do, is there's like 1,000 different ways that I can approach it and realize this thing is only going to go up forever. And they're all pretty darn likely to be true. The one that we're talking about right now is more about like, in this frame of reference, Bitcoin isn't a speculative thing I'm going to buy to get rich quick. That's not how we're talking about this right now. How we're talking about this is my worldview is that the future is unknown. There's likelihood that it's going to be more different than my present and past is. And hey, man, I'm looking around. I'm thinking things are probably about to get dicey, just like politically and everything. Environmentally, things aren't going to get better. So I need an insurance policy on that. That's a
Yeah.
very different mindset. Like, I'm not going to buy, 100% of my wealth worth of Bitcoin so that I become a millionaire next year. That's People do that. I think that's a great idea for its own reasons. But the argument we're making is just, dude, just buy 2%. In the off chance that things get really bad, and then you're glad that you own Bitcoin as an insurance policy. Not because you think you're going to get rich on it or something like that, but just like common sense, diversify into something that could protect you from that 100-year storm.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm curious about from you, I think the 100-year storm so far in this conversation is purely theoretical, and it needs to be made tangible. What are things that we've seen happen in the world in the recent 5 years and that you think are likely to reoccur or start occurring in the next five that, like, our neighbor Joe Schmo over here would say that's relevant to me, and if I don't have protection against that, I'm going to be sorry about it in the future. I have my own examples, but I want to hear from you first.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I get it. Although I think I think my honest answer is I think one needs to look at longer than 5 years. There's a great quote
Mm.
by Ray Dalio, and I agree with it, being that basically the farther into the future you want to see, the farther back in time you need to look. Right now, that typically is not what we do inherently. Right? Most people on Wall Street, they look back at the last 4 weeks, 4 months, 4 quarters, 4 years, maybe 40 years, and they extrapolate to the future. Right? Like almost all CFAs, retirement people, um, you know, uh, dividend people, hedge fund people, and financial advisors, analysts, whatever, like all of them basically are looking at post 1940 America, right? It's like all of
Mm.
them are looking at the last 80 years and it's something we could predict in the next 80 years. But I think the problem with that is that if if there is any cycle in human history that takes longer than 80 years to unfold, you are almost certainly going to miss that because the window of every instance is outside the window at which you're looking, right? So likewise, let's take a recent example within the last 5 years being the pandemic in 2019, 2020, right? The big pandemic. Obviously, that changed the world and very few people saw that coming. Why did very people see that coming? Well, if one had only
Hadn't
looked
happened in 8 years.
right, yeah, if one only looked at the last 5 years before 2019, back to 2014, one could say, oh, well, there has never been a global pandemic, and so there never will be a global pandemic. Yeah, there'll be scares, and there'll be local isolated incidents, right? Ebola, whatever. But if one only looked at the last 5 years, oh, there's never been a global famine. There's never been a global pandemic. But if you look back
Mm.
500 or 5,000 years, you see in history there have been global pandemics, there have been global wars, there have been global famines. And so I think the
Hmm.
same thing is true in a monetary sense and a government sense, right? Because, if this assumption that we're saying is true, that global wealth we determine in terms of who can possess the most commodities and consume them without starving to death the longest. And if, as societies develop, it all comes down to who has the best index to represent that wealth, who has the best numerical, abstract representation of that wealth. I think if we view it that way, that is basically describing all of geopolitical history, right? From the Greeks to the Romans to the Persians to the Mongols to the Romans to the British to ancient India, ancient China, all of the New World, North and South America, Incas, Mayans, whomever, and then of course, as you described before, even the Dutch, Spanish, and British, French colonies in North and South America, and now America itself, right? All of these political empires, I think, just a huge force between them all that we don't really learn about in school because it's a lot harder to test general knowledge and understanding of the world versus dates and names. Like, really, that's what it all comes down to. When two major empires, two major countries, each have their own index, their own world order, their own political system over resources, that is a really big problem, right? If you have country A and country B, both of them have their own constitutions, their own currencies, their own politicians, and they both have their own resources. They want to survive, they want to expand, because if they don't expand, the other one will expand and take them over, right?
Mm.
And that doesn't even necessarily mean that we want to kill everyone else in the other country. We just want to live, right? America wants to live. We don't want North Korea to take us over, right? And so if America becomes pacifist, like, we will cease to exist, right? And so we have to make sure we always are expanding, or at least not being expanded into. And so the problem is that if we have our index of resources, which in America we have as the dollar, or Rome, it was their coinage, it was their currency. The ancient Chinese had theirs, the Dutch had theirs, the French had theirs, the British had theirs, the Portuguese, the Spanish, all of them had their own. And the problem is that if that world order is under threat, if that index is under threat, everything else starts to deteriorate. I was at dinner last night with a couple of family members of mine, and they were complaining to me that another family member of ours is really into communism, right? And they were explaining to, or
Mm.
not really into it, but more so anti-capitalism than pro-communism. Okay, more so that, which I think
Sure.
a lot of people in modern America are, because they feel like they've been taken advantage of by it. And the funny thing was that they were talking about how this family member was like, oh, capitalism's bad because they're monopolies and this and that, the other, and how my other family member was explaining that, no, that's not good. Yeah, none of us like monopolies, blah blah blah. It was like a whole 20-minute discussion. I was just sitting there watching, and it was like, you know, we're just leaving the elephant out of the room here. Like, we can complain about Amazon as a monopoly, Facebook is a monopoly, this and that, the other is a monopoly, but nobody's mentioning the fact that the biggest monopoly of all in the global economy is the monetary monopoly, right? A monetary monopoly, index of all human productivity, that is being diluted, debased, distorted for political whim, right? And so the problem is that people can complain that, oh, capitalism is broken because of these big monopolies. They can make that claim. I don't necessarily agree with that claim, but they can make that claim. But unfortunately, they're missing the forest for the trees, even within their own argument. Even though I don't agree with the argument, they're missing the forest for the trees, because the biggest monopoly by a factor of 100, or at least by a factor of 50, is the monetary one. And ironically, the existence of a monetary monopoly then incentivizes and eventually requires the existence of non-monetary monopolies, right? If you have a monopoly over the currency, you also need a monopoly over information, so you can control and suppress and censor information around that, right? Because the currency is not in a free market, and so therefore, in order to defend that free market, you also need a monopoly on information. You need a monopoly on
Mm-hmm.
violence. You need a monopoly on the heart and soul of the country, of the entity, right? And so I know I'm kind of going on a rant here. You asked about the last 5 years, and I'm going on this rant, but my point is that if we only look at the last 5 years, we might be able to predict the next 5 years. And any cycle we see that is less than 5 years, we will be able to predict that. But most cycles, if not all cycles, outside the 5 year window, we just inherently won't see. And so what I think we're looking at here, and jump in
Mm.
if you want, but I can elaborate what I think we're looking at. What I think we're going to look at here is that we have this global monetary standard. We have a global index of human productivity and of technology, which we call the US dollar. That currency technically was started, way back in the late 1700s, but then it changed multiple times. Then it changed in 1913 with the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States of America, although we did have two central banks before the Federal Reserve. Both of those were dissolved. Then we had the Federal Reserve in 1913. That was a really big change in relatively recent history. 1944 was the next one. And now we're living in the post 1971 dollar standard. And so the problem is that America has been in charge of the world. America has used the dollar as this index, again, this abstract way to communicate resources, right? People buy dollars not because the dollars have any value themselves. People buy the dollars because they are buying a percentage share of all the outstanding shares of dollars, right? If you have $1 billion, you have some percentage, a small percentage, but some percentage of all of them, right? Whether it's $100 or $100 billion, and with those dollars, you are essentially buying the commodities that America produces, right? You know that as long as the American government survives and it is able to defend the country and defend the wealth of the country, those dollars are going to have some kind of purchasing power. And the problem is that since 1944, since the post of World War II, America has been the dominant power. And what we do is we dilute our own index for purchasing power and distribute that to the rest of the world. So let's say, Jake, you're in El Salvador, as an example. I'm America. I go to El Salvador. I point a gun at you and say, "Oh, this is a violence. This is a economic sanction. You have to use the American dollar as your legal tender. Use American dollar." And now, as an American, what I can do is I can dilute my own index and distribute the units of that index currency to you, and I'm able to get your labor for slightly cheaper because I diluted it to you, right? And that's what America has been doing for 80 years against the Chinese, against the Mexicans, against the El Salvadorans, against Europe, against Australia, against Africa, the whole world. We've been exporting new shares of our global index, which why to get more of those commodities to back the index, right? And it's worked out, right? Like, yeah, sure, I'm increasing the number of shares beyond 100%. And yeah, that's bad. It makes prices go up. But in the process, we're getting more commodities as a result. But the problem is that eventually, like a forest fire, you run out of monetary premium to exploit. And eventually, you no longer are exploiting new technologies, but you're actually having to consume and what I would call cannibalize the resources that are already existent.
Mm.
And I think that is the problem we have now. And so where Bitcoin comes in is that I think this is the big problem, and I think this is why World War III is highly likely in the coming years, maybe decades, because I think this is the fundamental power dynamic that's happening, is that America is exploiting the rest of the world. China is exploiting their influence, predominantly the rest of Southeast Asia and Africa, some parts of South America. And the problem is that because we're at this point where monetary premium is no longer being created but just shifted around, eventually this currency war is going to have to accelerate into economic sanctions, basically economic war. And if we're not careful, it's going to spill over into kinetic war, violent war. And again,
Mm.
going back to your initial question, which I'm now elaborating on for a very long time, but your initial question about 5 years, I think this is the fundamental problem, is that if we look back at the last 50 years, 500 years, or 5,000 years, we see this clearly. I can give lots of historical examples. Maybe you want me to go into that or not, but you could look at between the British and the French with the American Revolution. You could look at between the Americans and the British and the Civil War, which some might not know what I'm talking about, but that was there. You could look at lots of empires of the colonies. You could look and compare the Spanish and Portuguese in the late 1400s. You can look and compare all sorts of examples with the many rises and falls of Chinese empires. You can look at all across history, and that is essentially what is being fought over. Who has the bigger guns, and who is going to win the war, so then they can set the rules, and they can be the ones to control and manage the numerical system that represents global productivity. Because inherently, the largest entity on Earth, the largest entity or institution, that's a better word, the largest institution managed by humans on Earth, the most powerful one, inherently gets the right to control who makes the numbers that everyone then uses to represent commodities to each other, right? And so where Bitcoin comes in is that Bitcoin does not have that same constraint of requiring human institutions to manage it, because it is simply an algorithm that anyone can spend electricity to enforce, right? So the only way to participate is by, having to agree with it. And so anyway, I've kind of gone on so long with your question. I don't really remember
I think I know how to bring this full circle.
Yeah, bring it,
I think I
please.
know how to bring this full circle. the initial question was last 5 years and the next 5 years. For somebody who's new to Bitcoin, why is it an insurance policy they need? Let's give specific examples. And you said, I actually think that 10-year window is much less relevant than what's about to happen in a bigger window relative to the last 100 plus. And you start this conversation about the changing world order. Now, let me reiterate the world order story, because this is very important. I think very few people, like just down to earth people, they're like, the backbone of America actually know this story. So to reiterate what you've said, we had a couple world wars. They were largely fought in Europe, not in America. And all those countries had resources that they wanted to protect, but they were afraid they were about to lose the war. So they sent them over to America for safekeeping. And then America is sort of like, we're this third party neutral. We're not getting involved, but we'll sit on your gold for you because we're geopolitically safe, right? War ends after we were kind of involved a little bit after World War II. I think we get more credit than we probably deserve. We have all this gold, and the Bretton Woods Agreement happens in the 40s, where we say, how about we just hang on to the gold for you? It's safe here. We'll just keep it, and we'll peg our US dollar to the gold that we already have, and then we'll peg all of your other world's currencies to the dollar. So by extension, you own gold, and the dollar is just this meaningless middleman.
Could I add to that?
All these other countries. Yeah.
Yeah, so the dollar is an abstract numerical system to represent gold, which really is a different, harder, more abstract numerical system to represent the things we actually care about: food, water, shelter, right? So it's like an abstraction of the abstraction. So anyway.
Yeah. And then, now, one layer out further with every other country's currency. Now, this lasted for decades, like 3 decades of stability. There really wasn't inflation in currencies anywhere because everything was pegged through the US dollar back to gold. And then in 71, Nixon said, I don't think I want to do this, and he depegged from gold. Now, an analogy of what this would have felt like is, you actually almost said this a minute ago. If I imagine every country in the world as like a kid on the playground, and the US happened to grow early. Just we got lucky, and we grew a foot taller than everyone else, so we got to set the rules of the playground. And that works as long as we also abide by them. But in 1971, we broke the rule that we made. We broke the terms of the engagement we set. And in 71, Nixon said, all right, we're going to keep the gold, but now the dollar is worth whatever we say it is, and therefore all of your currencies are also worth whatever we say they are. And we don't have to actually have gold to back that. There are a few countries that were like, hey, I'm shipping you my paper dollars back because I want my gold. And the US just said, too bad, so sad, you can keep it. So that was like a major event that was sort of the beginning of the end of that world regime. Now, that's been 50 years since then. And what we've seen is the US has continually abused the rules on the playground. They're just becoming a bully. So another good example recently was US started to play by rules that the US didn't love. Russia started to play by rules that the US didn't love. And we said, yeah, all this money that you've given us to pay for our debt, we're just not going to give you back because we don't like what you're doing, which is the first time we ever just defaulted on debt on a global scale as a country. No one ever thought we would do that, and we just did it. So now all the kids on the playground are like, wait a second.
Yeah.
He just did that to Russia. He might do that to me. And all these other world powers that have been for decades, exporters as countries, they make money as countries. America doesn't. We lose money, and we depend on them to foot the bill by buying our debt, our bonds, like half of our bonds. They're all like kind of looking around thinking, maybe this music has stopped. I think I'm going to go start a new game over here on a different playground and just leave the bully over there. Now, if all of that story leading up for this world order, if somebody tells me that story, I go, yep, that's real, that's happening, and it's inevitable that the US as the bully is no longer gonna get to be in charge. It's gonna be an ugly end, and the shifting of world order from one playground set to the other and like all of that reordering always involves chaos. And so what you're saying is all that's about to happen and is we have no idea what that's going to look like because no one's alive who's seen a world order change. And it never changes the same way twice. Right. So it's like any examples we can give of what's happened in the last 5 just don't matter. They're trivial compared to what's potentially to come. And I completely agree with that. Now, to wrap this all up, I still think it's important for us to give real examples of why Bitcoin is a good insurance policy for things that have happened in the recent memory of people who are alive,
Yeah.
even if they feel small and trivial relative to what's actually happening on a global scale. So I have a couple of stories of like things I've seen happen to people, but I'm wondering if you have anything that you've seen happen recently that feels like that makes Bitcoin a worthy insurance policy.
Yeah, I think there's lots of practical examples. I think probably the best way to say it is that Bitcoin is an insurance policy that if the rules change, you won't be left without any rules, basically, right? Like if we can distill all these countries, and you made a great point about bringing up World War I, right? Most people don't know why did we even fight World War I, right? Why did we fight the 7 Years War over Ohio, right? It's like people don't understand, why did Napoleon, like, actually, why did it happen, right? Because it's not just, we like to dub down history and say, oh, it's just one person took in charge and brainwashed
Right,
everyone into doing this thing to kill a lot of people, when really it's a lot more complicated than that, right? And we don't take the time.
right.
And I think if we took the time, that's what we would find, is that we have group of people A, group of people B. Each groups of people want to continue to exert dominance, and one of the best ways to do that is to change who controls the monopoly of the abstract index of how you denominate the world's wealth, right? And so I think, again, you asked for practical examples. I'll try to get to that, but I think that's probably the best way to think about Bitcoin. Is that the bullish argument and the bullish argument, the optimist happy argument for Bitcoin is one and the same with the pessimistic scary argument, right? The optimistic case for Bitcoin is that so far in human history, all of the different indexes for wealth have been political means, political currencies, political monopolies,
They've been co-opted. Yeah.
which can be co-opted because of political incentives and because of human beings, and humans are depraved, right? But Bitcoin being an
Hmm.
apolitical index for for human prosperity, for wealth, that optimism in that is that all of the other indexes, all the other paradigms, all the other sets of rules, all the other kids in their playground, right? All of those are worthless compared to the correct index, right? Um, so that's the
Hmm.
optimistic way to look at it. But the pessimistic way is that that Bitcoin is insurance on the failure of all of those. And so what does that mean
Right.
practically? That means bank runs. That means the devaluation of the dollar more than anything, meaning house prices go up, food prices go up, energy prices go up. Um, and theoretically, if someone were to do to us what we did to Russia by canceling them on the SWIFT system, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, that would be catastrophic. I can get into a really practical example if you want. I don't know if it's exactly what you're going for, but to me, the most practical example, or the most likely one, and the one that's probably the least pessimistic, the one that I think is the least pessimistic is the one I'm hoping for. So the one that I would like to think is most likely is that other countries dump as many U.S. treasuries as they can back to the U.S., right? Basically, all these other countries, right? Whatever, Russia, China, Europe, whomever, right? Rest of the world saying, we're going to send all of our debt back to you. We're going to send all the debt that we bought from you back to you. And we're going to, basically, it's an attack. It's a collaborative attack, not with the rest of the world sending us
Hmm.
nukes, but with the rest of the world sending us all these bonds. Let's collapse your bond prices, because then that really, really derails your ability to print more dollars, right? It's like, we're sick of you printing dollars and giving to us. We're going to send all of our debt back to you. So now that, we're not on the hook or whatever, right? And the problem is that, like musical chairs, that's heavily incentivized once it starts. But what that means for the average person watching this, and unfortunately, I think when this happens, it's going to be very confusing to people, because, like the pandemic in 2020, it's not an issue one day, then all of a sudden it's a big issue, and then everyone has an opinion,
Hmm.
and most people know nothing about it, right? And I think what that means for the average person is that then it becomes heavily incentivized for the United States, to, number one, print more dollars, number two, confiscate wealth, meaning, number three, the value of assets just continues to rise, right? So that would be what I would say practically is very likely to happen. That I believe either we are going to have some form of kinetic global war, or we're going to have some degree of rapid asset repricings upwards, even though housing already feels ridiculously expensive, even though stocks already
Hmm.
feel ridiculously overpriced, even though Bitcoin feels like it's already so expensive. Like it is in the interest of America and the rest of the countries, unfortunately, to continue forcing their asset prices up as quick as possible so they can retain as much influence as possible. And so, anyway, I don't know if I answered the question the way you wanted or the way you were thinking, but
That's all right. This is great. I want to do the same thing again
yeah.
and reiterate this back to you. And then I have two stories that I want to tell. What we're seeing happening for anyone who's new to like the sovereign bond deal with other countries buying US debt. Basically, imagine you are Russia or China and you make a lot of money as a country. You need to do something with that money that you've made. It can't just sit in your own currency because your own currency is not really worth much. You
Right.
have to invest in something that's a better store of value, like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation. Meanwhile, next door, the US isn't making a lot of money. In fact, our like production of revenue via taxes, my understanding at least, is about half of our overhead. So we have 50% of what it costs to run this country that we have to raise. We have to fundraise every year by selling bonds, by selling, in other words, please, banker, give me a loan. And the banker happens to be anyone who wants to buy a bond. That can be you and me. That can be another country. And so all these other countries are buying US bonds. But what you're saying is we're proving to them that they shouldn't trust us anymore. Their incentive to buy our bonds is decreasing. In other words, they don't want to play on the playground with us anymore because the bully was abusing his own rules. They're going to make their own game.
Mm-hmm.
We're already seeing that happen with the BRICS agreement. If you haven't heard of that, I suggest, I'm not talking to you, Luke, but the audience, is you research it. Um, then what we're going to have happen is over time, all these other countries that are net exporters, rich countries like Russia and China, they're going to stop buying US bonds. And we're already seeing that happen. They're buying less and less every year. It's like at a pace that's reasonable that won't destroy the world. But that pace is likely to continue. And pretty soon the US will be looking around and saying, we got to raise half our budget.
Yeah.
And no one wants to buy our debt because no one likes us anymore. All we can do is just print it ourselves. And that's a dicey situation.
Well,
Okay, so
yeah. Well, the critical component there, which I think you're saying well, but the critical component is the common phrase that risk happens fast, right? To use a house fire as an example, if let's say your house is worth $100,000 and you're looking to buy it, risk happens fast. What that means is that right now it's worth $100,000, but if you have an arsonist come along and they light a small fire, like a very small fire, a small one, like maybe a couple of feet tall, they light a small one in one of the rooms, even if it would take an hour for the whole house to burn down to the ground, if you are an investor where you're trading paper to represent the value of the house, the problem is that if you're an investor and you like as soon as you with your binoculars see the arsonist
mm,
like a tiny little fire, the paper collapses down to zero, right? Another
right,
example,
I don't want to touch that asset.
right, exactly. And so another example would be, to use a more technological example that I like to use would be the horse and the locomotive, right? It's that if we could trade paper, you and me, like let's say I was the guy that thought horses are always going to be here, right? Horses have been around for thousands of years. They're always going to be around. Horses are going anywhere. And let's say you, Jake, were the big locomotive advocate and we were trading paper betting on that, right? I got all my wealth in horse futures. You have all your wealth in locomotive futures, right? As soon as I see the locomotive for myself, as soon as I internalize that and understand that for myself, the value of that paper to me becomes worthless and I sell it all to some other poor guy who's going to buy it off me, right? Probably at a
Right.
discounted price, right? Because markets are inherently future looking, right? Just like back to the beginning of the
Mm,
conversation, wealth,
right.
all of wealth, purchasing power is about how much can that help you survive in the future, right? It has nothing
In
to
the
do with it
future.
today, right? And so what you're describing with the bonds is exactly that, is that if something is going to unwind, then it's going to seem like it will never happen until suddenly it looks like it could happen, in which case
And then the prophecy self
it's
fulfills.
a prophet that self-fulfills, right?
Right.
Like I guess just to wrap up my point, let's say the house, right? Let's say the house is worth 100 grand. Arsonist lights a fire. Yeah, if we had a firefighter right here, right now, they might be able to put it out and save the house and therefore the $100,000. But if I'm the investor and I look at that, I think to myself, crap, there's a 1% chance this house is going to burn to the ground in the next hour. That is an asymmetric downside for me. I should probably sell a portion of this
Right.
paper representing the house. Now, the problem is that that house is now only worth $80,000 because I'm pricing in a 1% chance it's going to burn to the ground because that fire could burn the whole thing down in an hour. But the problem is that now the firefighter has a lower economic incentive to save the house, right? He
Mm.
has less incentive to save the house. And now I'm a different investor that also owns some of the paper representing that house. And I realize, well, crap, yeah, there's now a 2% chance the house is going to burn down to the ground because I estimate the effort the firefighter is going to be willing to risk his life for, right? Because all economics, it takes life force to produce. Well, now there's a higher percentage.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a 2% chance. Yeah, sure, we're down 20%, down from 100 grand to 80 grand. But I think there's 2% chance now. It's just, I need to sell off my paper too, right? And basically, as the fire grows and grows, even if it was salvageable at first and able to be stopped, the problem is that, 5 minutes into the fire, now the fire has taken up the whole kitchen. Yeah, you could probably save the whole house, the whole rest of the house by, dousing the kitchen with water. The firefighter would have to go into it. But the problem is that now you have a cost with trying to repair the house, and it's more likely the house is going to burn down. And you have this fee. This is why people in Bitcoin obsess.
So eventually people just,
Mhm.
you might as well just let the house burn.
Right, exactly.
At a certain point, it's totaled.
Yeah, you are watching the paper value of the house collapse faster than the actual physical house itself is collapsing, and the value of the
Correct.
paper derivative of the house collapsing incentivizes and accelerates the collapse of the house because then the firefighter is less willing to participate. The house itself actually is worth less as it's burning down. And so, anyway,
Right.
this is what the whole phrase "risk happens fast" means: is that it's just that kind of methodology. Now, I can get into how Bitcoin ties back into that, but I know you have a couple stories I'd love for you to share.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, so now that we've sort of set the table, this is actually, I'm glad we did this. This was a helpful table setting, that there's a lot of risk that's going to happen fast in the next, who knows how many years, could be very few. What are some whispers or tremors that we're seeing that's already starting to happen? And how would that affect you, the listener, who's just a regular person, right? None of us are the marshal of some grand military or something.
Right.
I own a house. I go see my aunt in Milwaukee every weekend. That's my life, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I have two stories.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. Yeah, to be perfectly clear for everyone watching is that, neither you, Jake, or I claim to know the future, right? Like neither of us know where the arsonist is going to start the fire, nor how they're going to start. I've got no flippant idea if he's going to use gasoline or diesel or
right.
some sort.
If it'll start in the kitchen or the living room,
right? It's like where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, who's going to start it, and for what motive or reason. All of those things, it's basically a 0% chance we'll predict, right? But
right.
being able to predict the game theory once it does happen is near 100%. So anyway,
well said. All right, two quick stories. First story, I hope a lot of people are already familiar with this, but whenever I talk Bitcoin, I bring it up, and it surprises me how many people haven't heard this, which is the truckers' protest in Canada that happened during COVID. So, in the American conscious, Canada is sort of like a sister country. They're very similar politically, economically, very similar, the most similar. All these conservative truckers protested by basically blockading roads so that food couldn't get in and out because COVID was shutting down their lives economically. The government didn't like that, and so they basically blackmailed or took captive all of the banking structures that the people who were participating in the blockade or were donating to the blockade via, I think, GoFundMe, all of those accounts were frozen at the government's command. So there's all these regular people who just believed in that with, their freedom of speech in a democratic country that's a lot like America to donate to that cause. And the government said, I don't like that you did that. I'm freezing your bank accounts. And those people couldn't pay rent. They couldn't buy groceries. They couldn't do anything until those accounts were unfrozen. That feels like that's not the modern world. That feels like World War II world, right? Tyrannical Russia or something where you're not allowed to do certain stuff without huge consequences. That really happened to real people a few years ago. And then the other story is personal to me. I went to buy a hammock on Facebook Marketplace a couple summers ago. Okay. I show up at this townhouse and there's this little old lady, frail old woman, and her entire house is in her garage and driveway. Everything. So I strike up a conversation with her and immediately realize she has a thick accent, something like Russian or Ukrainian. Turns out this lady is on her second garage sale, but this is everything she owns. She's from Ukraine and she has family in both Ukraine and Russia. And this is just recently, last year or two. She's unable to wire money to her family, who are completely broke and literally starving, and she has like sons who are fighting in the war. She's unable to wire money, like she doesn't trust it or she just physically cannot. And it's super unsafe and a bad idea to try to ship cash physically because it's highly likely to be intercepted and kids will never see it. Or she was even saying that it's like statistically very likely that the post office will get blown up before it gets to the kids. So her best final option was to put all of this cash, $14,000 by the way, sewn into a winter coat. And she flew over to Russia, which is illegal. I'm pretty sure $2,000 is the limit you can carry. So she smuggled all that money over there to keep her family alive, right? That happened a year ago. So then I remember like my mom telling me when she was young, this is like late 80s, she visited the Berlin Wall right after it came down. And there were people who, I mean, if you're a student of history, you know, a citizen of that country, a resident of that city, if you tried to leave the city, your own police would snipe you. You weren't allowed to leave. And that was when we had color television. So all of these stories are kind of like, dude, if things get dicey in America, because like we're saying with this big changing world order, and for any reason you think there maybe is a 1% chance you'd like to have the liberty to leave, to exit a dicey situation, you might not be able to do that easily, or you might be faced with a decision like, either I leave right now with my family and I can bring nothing I own and we start over at zero, or I stay with what I own and endure this.
Right.
But with Bitcoin, you don't have that problem.
Yeah.
You can go anywhere you want. No one can take it from you. No government controls it. There's no playground bullies setting the rules. Bitcoin's rules are above that, outside of it.
Yeah.
So those are the couple of examples I was hoping to tell.
Yeah, no, those are great examples. And I think that's frankly why I think Americans are so behind. Americans are really behind on understanding Bitcoin, right? Granted,
yeah, because the problems aren't acute for them yet.
Right, yeah. In North Korea, Latin America, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, and parts of the Middle East, and a lot of Eastern Europe, those are people that understand this much better. Granted, maybe they're at like 0.5% adoption, and America is like at 0.1% adoption. So granted, to the average person, both look equivalent, but on a percentage terms, it's much farther in other places of the world. But
right.
if I could take what you've just said and put it back into the metaphor, is that the way I would explain Bitcoin in this arson fire example. Bitcoin, so the paper represents a house, right? It collapses to zero faster than the value of the house, right? Bitcoin, for all the reasons you just described, Jake, to me, when I look at Bitcoin is a better paper derivative of the house, and built into that, it has a fire insurance policy. And so the irony is that when the house is on fire, your best incentive is still to own that Bitcoin paper derivative, because it's both the optimism and the pessimism, right? You know that if the paper, the inferior paper that represents the house collapses to zero, like you had your fire insurance policy, you're going to be okay. But at the same time, because you actually own the paper, you actually make it more likely that the firefighter is going to still have the incentive to put out the fire, right? Like I explained before, if the paper value of the house collapses faster than the house itself, the firefighter has no more incentive to risk his life to save the house. But if the firefighter knows that there's still going to be some paper value to the house, then he still has incentive to save it, right? And so this is why people in Bitcoin become so, in my view, passionate, is because we're here talking about how America's monetary regime, America's game, America's political currency, just like every empire in history, probably at some point is going to have to reset to some degree. And I believe that it's going to reset into Bitcoin. And the beauty is that the best hope for America, in my view, is to adopt that as quickly as possible, right? So the irony is that because you and I, Jake, are so into Bitcoin, so passionate about it, we believe it is almost certain that political currency is going to collapse to zero. Like, I believe it's almost certain, even though
Mm,
that is horrifying to think about, and that would result
right.
in the death of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. The beauty is
Yeah, we
that,
hope it doesn't happen.
right, we hope it doesn't happen. But if you are going to have the global index of human productivity collapse to zero, the best possible thing you can hope for is to, in the midst of that collapse, have a new index that people can transfer to, right? Because if they
Right.
don't transfer,
Phoenix is up out of the
it
ashes.
phoenixes up simultaneously, right? And so instead of people resorting
Exactly.
to violence and to bigger gun diplomacy, they can resort to the new index, right? And so I think it's the irony
Yeah.
in that because we're pessimists so much that come to Bitcoin, we're also optimists because of the pessimism. It's like this flywheel
Right.
effect, and to me, I find that
Hmm.
fascinating. And really, Bitcoin number go up. Most people, when they talk about a 1 million, 10 million, $50 million Bitcoin, they're coming either from only one of those two, right? Either from the optimist perspective that we're going to build so much more, the world's going to be better, or the pessimistic perspective being we're going to have hyperinflation. But I think the
Hmm.
more, let's say, mature view of that is that it's actually both, and it's both
It's
wrapped into
both.
one.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I agree. Completely agree.
yeah. So anyway, I know I'm doing it right when half of my comment section say I'm a pessimist, and the other half say I'm an optimist. So yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah. So maybe we should talk about what that could look like practically. I'm happy to give my take, but I also want to hear yours because I know you probably have a different perspective than me. Like what? Like,
You go first.
well, I think the most likely is similar to what I said before. I think other countries call America's bluff. They dump as many treasuries
Right.
as they can, force the value of the treasuries down, which forces the value of their debt up more, right? Strengthening themselves. And I think America's going to realize we will not be able, because this is what will happen without Bitcoin. What will happen without Bitcoin is that countries dump the paper because they call it a bluff. Arson and the
Hmm.
fire, it happens very, very quickly. Because it happens quickly, more people freak out, more people get scared. And eventually, America realizes, crap, if this continues, we are going to run out of funding for our military in 5 years, right? And some
Right.
people would say, oh, that means we can kick the can 5 years. Again, not necessarily, because everything in the
Risk
world
happens fast.
everything in the world's pricing in the future, right? And so,
Hmm.
if in a matter of a couple of weeks we had a bunch of countries dumping our treasuries and making it clear to the America military and executive branch that the faster treasuries dump today, even if it's a small move, the sooner it's accelerating, right? So 3 weeks ago we had enough money to last 10 years to fund our military.
Hmm.
Now we have enough money to last 8 years. If this continues,
Hmm.
in less than 6 weeks of people dumping treasuries now, we're going to accelerate the military to be able to last 18 months or whatever, right? So even though, basically a small change today has a rapid change for how far. And so basically,
Hmm.
theoretically, this kind of economic war could accelerate into some form of kinetic war quickly because then America or whatever power that be would realize that the relative strength of militaries is changing because in X number of months or years, Y country will not be able to afford Z barrels of oil needed to
Right.
maintain their military, right? And so then the question becomes, okay, how can we defend the value of the US dollar as quickly as possible? Well, we need to
Hmm.
have that abstraction of wealth, that numerical system, be backed by something that's more real, right? Well, okay, what
Hmm.
could we do? We could confiscate real estate. We could force up the price of real estate. We could force up the price of oil. We could force up the prices of assets. We could immediately stop trading with the rest of the world, which, of course, in human cost would mean, starvation around the world. But basically, let's keep all resources to ourselves. Let's stop exporting our freaking oil and keep it
Mm.
because we're going to run out, right? But then the other question becomes, okay, well, there is this other option or additional option. What is the asset that we could force up the price for the fastest, right? What is the new asset?
Mm.
What is the one asset we can force up in value the fastest that is going to have the most global liquidity, right? That's going to be the most exchangeable, right? That's not going to rot
Hmm.
like 1,000 ribeyes or 100 barrels of oil in the course of a few years or whatever, right? What is that asset? and what can we acquire alive, right? What can we force up the most?
Right.
What's going to be the most liquid in the future? Because that's all that matters. We're pricing in the future, and what can we buy the most of? And I think, like I'm alluding to, the answer would be Bitcoin, right? The government would have to print
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of
The only option.
right. It's the only one. Like, okay, Mr. President, our dollar's in trouble. People are dumping it. Like, if we print $100 trillion, we might be able to double the price of real estate in America. But we can print
Mm-hmm.
10 times less money and get 10 times the benefit for our balance sheet by just acquiring more Bitcoin, acquiring more gold, and forcing the prices of those things up, because we can manipulate those up much faster. And so, what I think
Mm-hmm.
that means in practical terms for most people is that I think it's very likely that either we have a continuation of this game theory and we result to war, or what I hope is that instead we continue this game theory and eventually governments realize the best way to defend their own dollars, their own political currencies, is to back it with the most liquid, the most unstoppable, uncensorable
Mm-hmm.
asset in the world, being Bitcoin. Back it with Bitcoin. And I guess to wrap up my little story here is that I think the best and compelling example to this, and a big part of what helped me understand this, was watching what Michael Saylor is doing with MicroStrategy
Mm.
consistently for the last 4.5 years. Like, what Michael Saylor is doing at the corporate level, I think is exactly what government's going to do at the national level, right? Michael Saylor, this will be my last part, right? So Jake, you know this, but Michael invited me to dinner a few months ago, and we talked a lot at dinner about his company in 2020 and how he saw exactly what I'm describing, right? About how, you know, Michael, and nothing I'm saying is confidential, of course, but Michael, both in private and in public, has described this about how in 2020 with the pandemic, um, his company was accelerating to bankruptcy, right? Like, again, it's a couple years away. Okay, now it's a year away. Now it's a few months away, right? Like, it's accelerating as other investors also see that it's accelerating, right? Risk happens fast. And essentially, he realized he could watch the premium of his stock, right, which is his abstraction for the actual productivity the company creates. He could watch that collapse to zero, or he could just adopt a Bitcoin standard. Like, he had nothing to lose,
Mm-hmm.
right? He could have bought Bitcoin in 2013 when he first heard of it, but he didn't. He didn't adopt it until he needed to, because he had no other option, because the company was going to
Right.
collapse in the course of a matter of months, right? And so he adopted Bitcoin. And the irony is that even though he is diluting MicroStrategy shares, the abstraction of the wealth they actually produce, even though he's diluting those, it actually means his stock price is going up. I mean, MicroStrategy was up 9% yesterday. It was up 7% the day before that. It's kind of ridiculous. But they just keep
Mm-hmm.
going up, right? And so, anyway, for people watching, I think that is the best practical example. I think what you're going to see in the future is that Bitcoin price will begin to skyrocket. It will go to $100,000. Right now, at the time of recording, is $65,000, but it'll go to $100,000. It'll go $1 million, $10 million, higher, lower. How high? At what time frame? I don't know. But I do believe governments will realize the best way to preserve their purchasing power without resulting going to war is to print their political currency and stockpile Bitcoin. So Bitcoin going to $1 million, yes, it is an optimistic, greedy perspective that we all want to get rich, but at the same time, it's also the fear perspective that, like, okay, you could say, I want to buy fire insurance on houses because I want to get rich. You also could say, I want to buy fire insurance on houses because all the freaking houses are going to burn down, right? And either
Mm-hmm.
way, it's the same result. Either way, the premium to house insurance skyrockets when that begins to start.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, I think that is what people are going to see. And the reason we're having this discussion, Jake, as you know, um, for everyone watching, is that a lot of people are going to see the price of fire insurance begin to rise and rise and rise, and they're going to think they're too late. They're going to think that they could have gotten rich, but they didn't. They're going to not understand what's going on. They're going to be confused. But unfortunately, I think people will not have years and years to understand that there is no top to fire insurance. It will just keep going up in value, because, and if you don't own the fire insurance and you own a paper derivative to the house itself, that may not be the best option. And so, anyway, the rambling conclusion here, I suppose, is that Bitcoin is radical number go up technology, because it is the least pessimistic outcome, which is also the optimistic view, I guess. So anyway,
Yeah, if we opened this call with like what's the bullish case for Bitcoin, and I went down this path of like one example is it eating the monetary premium of historical stores of value. It's a better store of value, so people are going to sell real estate to buy Bitcoin. People are going to sell gold to buy Bitcoin. People are going to sell stocks to buy Bitcoin. Were previously serving the purpose of store of value for them. But that I actually think like that's easier for a person to understand when they're first getting into Bitcoin, but it's a far smaller lever for what will turn Bitcoin into the $1 million+ asset in the near term. And what you're talking about now is for sure that. Like as soon as I was just in on Twitter was just talking with somebody about this little book called Fiat Money Inflation in France. I don't remember the guy's name. I think it's A.D. White who wrote it a long time ago, maybe 100 years ago even, but it's about France several hundred years ago. And they did everything the US is doing now and is about to continue to do. And it almost feels like prophecy for how this is going to go down.
yeah,
And how fast that happens is mind bending. And there's like pictures in the book and real examples. It's worth a read. Anyways, point is, the scale of things blows up so fast if the U.S. starts to panic buy.
right.
If the dollar gets dicey, everything changes. So let me give you an example. People always talk about the U.S. dollar ought to be backed by Bitcoin. I've been thinking about that. You have to tell me, like, correct my logic where I'm wrong about this, but I think that that's physically entirely impossible. Here's why. Let's pretend Bitcoin didn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
but we still have all the same problems. The US needs to back their dollar with something scarce again, go off of fiat back to, let's say, the gold standard. The problem is, since 1971 when we left, we've increased our money supply like crazy. So the idea is if you take your dollars to the bank, they'll give you an equivalent amount of gold back, right?
Yeah.
But gold is worth something today
Right.
more than it was back then. So the US would need to buy a bunch of gold equivalent to the value of the money supply that's in existence so that they can guarantee if the whole world comes back and says, I want my gold in exchange for my dollars, the US can do that. So in the case of them backing with Bitcoin, how many Bitcoin at the current value of Bitcoin would they need to be able to back all of the dollars in existence in the system? Dude, it's 1.67 billion Bitcoin. There is no physical way. And also, as soon as they start to do that at all, even like take a tiny drop out of that bucket, Bitcoin's price goes up and it gets exponentially harder to do that. So in France and Germany and every other country that's had these huge inflation problems, every time that this happens, at least what I've seen historically, is they try over and over to like, they get the defibrillators out and they shock the currency, the fiat currency, to try to save it.
Right.
And for a second, it like resuscitates and then it dies even harder. And they shock it again.
Right.
Resuscitates for a few months and then it dies even harder. And eventually, the only way that they survive every time is by creating a totally new currency in parallel.
Correct.
Once the fiat currency starts to die, there is no saving it. It's like a law of nature. So this is where you have to tell me if I'm wrong about this. The only way that the U.S. survives, I think, is A, we have to own Bitcoin as a treasury, and then we just let the U.S. dollar die by also supporting Bitcoin as legal tender.
Yeah.
Because I don't think the U.S. dollar works as an actual non-fiat currency.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, again, if we just step back and think first principles, that true wealth in the world, the only thing people care about is how many commodities do you have? Oxygen, oxen, food, water, shelter. And how can we, like, how likely are you to have that in the future? That's all that matters. Everything else is an index representing that, right? And so if, again, we think of it just like that, the current index, the current dollar is fraudulent. And in history, what happens is exactly what you're describing. You're spot on, is that when trust in, because we need an index, right? Not everybody can save in cows and ribeye and right. It's like you can't save your electricity and batteries. You have to save your money to buy future electricity, right? Like it's impossible. So we need an index. And so you're exactly right, Jake. When one political currency, one monetary index fund, let's say, dies, you have to have a new one to replace it. So I guess to back up a bit, so the first empire in the world, and actually this gets back to Bitcoin, but the first empire in the world to have a central bank were the Dutch, right? This was the Dutch Empire. The Dutch were incredibly powerful at their time, right? The Dutch had the spice trade; they were trading with Eastern Asia. The Dutch were in charge, right? They were beating Britain in naval battles, right? We always think of Britain as being with the greatest navy in the world, and they did for their time. But before them were the Dutch, right? The Dutch were incredibly
Mm.
powerful. New York City, most Americans forget this, but New York City was first New Amsterdam, right? That's how incredibly powerful the Dutch were, that the Dutch were settling New York more than the British at first, right? And we've completely forgotten that because so much time has passed, and the British, when they dominated,
Mm.
were so much more powerful, right? And so this is the problem. What happens when in the 1630s, 40s, 50s, when the Dutch begin to decline? What happens to them? Well, they wrote off their bonds. About half of the country's wealth was dissolved. The Dutch had not defaulted on their bonds for 300 years, right? Again, let's talk about cycles, right? In year 295, you can't look at years 290 to 295 to predict that we're going to all default in the year 300 or whatever, right? So, but the problem is that where did people run? The people ran from the Dutch to the French after the collapse of the Dutch, right? So we transitioned from the Dutch index down to the French one rising, right? We always need
Mm.
one. Now, typically, that is from one country to another if the countries are small enough, right? Now, in your example, Jake, if the country's big enough, then it's two paradigms within the same country, right? But in Europe,
Ah, yes. Yep.
in Europe, it was from one country to another, right? It was the Dutch in decline over to the French, and then from the French to the British. Once the British rose, and then that's where, going back to what I referenced earlier, the French involvement with the American Revolution. This was a big part of it, right? That basically, again, the Dutch had already been long gone as the dominant power. The French had risen up. The French were now very powerful, but of course, then you had Britain also vying for power, and these two powers were competing for who could exert more influence over each other in the New World, specifically Ohio, eventually down the line. But all the way back, even in the American Revolution, the French helped the Americans defeat the British because France knew that if we can help the American colonies back away from Britain, that is an advantage to us because we are
Mm.
severing that tie with our component to the northwest of us, right? And of course, the problem
Mm-hmm.
being that the French spent too much, and now the French index was in decline. And so this is where then, a couple decades later, over the course of decades, the French Revolution comes out, continued monetary chaos, a continual regime change, right? The French Revolution lasted years and decades, right? From group to group to group, eventually to Napoleon. Why did it keep going over and over and over? Because there wasn't a solid index for people to run to, right? It just kept resulting in war, 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 and eventually they consolidated around the most powerful individual, which was Napoleon. And then, of course, you have the British, who then rose up to fill that vacuum after the French. And then, of course, after World War One, what was the big economic tension? World War One, Germany versus Britain, France, right? Of course, Britain won. But again, just like how the French helped the Americans win against the British, sure, the British won against the Germans technically, but at the end of the day, they still lost the index or the ability to control the index because they were beaten down so much that eventually then America took place, right? So all that to say is that you are spot on, Jake. And what I think is going to happen is a very similar kind of scenario where, like, the dollar as it exists today cannot survive. It cannot sustain. Something
Right.
has to change. And the only three options I see are number one, a new, different country takes charge and is able to have the global
Mm.
reserve currency. Probably China is the only other country conceivably it could be. Maybe a BRICS, but that might be difficult to have those countries agree. Probably you just need one
Can
large
you
country.
imagine if the
Yeah.
U.S. said yes to playing along with that? Can
Well,
you
no, they
imagine?
can't. They can't, Jake. Right? They can't. Like, you can't have everybody agree to be in charge of the Ponzi scheme, right? The Ponzi scheme inherently has to have somebody that's the loser, right? So America can't agree to
Mm.
that, right? So that's what I'm saying is that scenario one is that America's index declines, the dollar declines, something else takes its place, BRICS, maybe, China, maybe, but I don't really think it was a stable. I think what's much more likely than that scenario is the CBDC scenario, right? So many people watching this have probably heard of a central bank digital currency. That is essentially what you're describing, Jake, or not what you described, but I think that is essentially um, the other alternate is that the dollar declines.
Mm.
America says, yeah, the dollar was bad. It was co-opted. It was, it's integrity, whatever. But we have this,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
have dollar 2.0, right? And for those who don't,
Yeah. And they name it something else.
right. I mean, because we got to keep in mind we had the Continental before the dollar, right? Before the American Revolution, every colony had its own currency. All those indexes for each of those colonies, all those political currencies collapsed after the Revolution. America adopted the Continental, and the Continental collapsed, and then we had the dollar. And so maybe a CBDC, as the dollar as it stands declines, there's a new reset, a global reset towards a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, as the new one. But I agree with you, Jake. I think by far the most likely scenario, if the destruction of America being controlled is the least likely, if the CBDC is more likely, I think by far in a way, the most likely scenario is that hyper Bitcoinization scenario, where the U.S. government realizes if we keep going down this path, either another country is going to take us over, or we're going to have to reset the dollar, and which is such a high risk, costly error. You probably have some sort of revolution, and you may not even make it to the other side. The by far the best asymmetric bet, and if I'm a politician, the best asymmetric bet for me to retain power is to inject Bitcoin into our stock, right? In the same way I was talking about MicroStrategy. I'll just pull it up here because the chart is so unbelievable, right? So this is MicroStrategy stock, right? Since 2014, right? It's like, Mr. President, if we want that to happen to our currency, it's like buy Bitcoin.
Do it Michael did.
Yeah, like again, it's literally again and this is where the macro experts will hate on me for saying, oh, well, a sovereign nation and corporation are different. It's like, no, they're not. It's all abstractions of the actual asset. And so MicroStrategy stock, which I just showed you, they had on the corporate level the same options. Either another company could take us over by buying us out and somehow save us, in which case we lose, or we could default and then have some sort of new, paper derivative of all the wealth that we created, which is, because all the paper is worthless. Or Michael Saylor went with the option, let's just inject Bitcoin into our balance sheet. Nobody can censor it. Nobody can stop it. It's absolutely scarce, right? And it's the same idea like a bank run. If you have $1 million of, or let's say more relatable number, right? Let's say you have 10 grand of cash in your bank account, and you have 10 grand of physical cash in your house. In the event of a bank run, the 10 grand of cash in your physical house is worth way more than the cash in a bank. And so Michael Saylor realized that the best way to defend the fiat premium, to defend the abstract paper derivative premium of the actual hard assets I own, is to buy the hard asset that is the least subject to dilution, to debasement, and to censorship, which is Bitcoin, and basically plug it in. So anyway, that was a very long answer.
Yeah, lace it into the other thing.
Yeah. So that was a very long answer to you, Jake. But
it's like a metal alloy. It's like titanium. We're lacing these things together,
right?
And without lacing Bitcoin into an existing asset, that asset's just gonna rust out, man.
Right.
You gotta lace in a little Bitcoin, and you got something new and usable again.
Right. Yeah. Because
okay, let me ask you. I have a point of clarity I want you to sit on for a second.
Okay, sure.
If we imagine, let's say, on a global scale, the rest of the countries continue to lose trust in the U.S. They don't want to play ball anymore. They're not here to buy our debt. The U.S. has bought a bunch of Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset. The dollar is not backed by Bitcoin. How does the valuation of the dollar react to all of those things, right? It feels like I don't know how to compute that in my head. Like, are we saying that we issue Bitcoin-backed bonds and now all the kids at the recess playground are going to agree to play with us again? What if that's not the case? Even if we have great Bitcoin-backed bonds, now is it just like we'll pay our own annual debt, our shortfall from tax revenue in all of our Bitcoin gains? And does the dollar still fail? Okay, I'm gonna shut up. You take that from there.
No. You're asking me questions, but you're the guest. So for those that don't know,
I need to know. I can't figure this out.
Yeah. Okay. So for those that don't know, I work at the Bitcoin Advisor. At Bitcoin Advisor, we help people take self-custody of the Bitcoin. That's really important because self-custody Bitcoin is the physical cash in your house safe. ETF Bitcoin, Bitcoin on exchanges, is the paper dollars you have in your bank, right? In the event of a bank run, you're going to need the physical thing, right? So it's a side note, self-custody is really important. But the reason I bring that up is because myself and my good friend Peter Dunworth and a few other people in Bitcoin who I who I consider pretty smart, we've all kind of come to the same conclusion. We've had different terms for it, but we've come to the same conclusion. I think it's going to be some sort of principal protected note, meaning if I'm an investor and I could buy $1 million of U.S. bonds, um, the problem is that I don't think those bonds can be worth a lot in the future, right? And so the problem is that okay, I'm going to buy $1 million of those bonds, U.S. debt, but again, risk happens fast. Again, think of like the house. I'm buying $1 million in house futures when one room of the house is on fire. Like that doesn't feel very good, right? But if you came to me and said, Mr. Investor, we have the perfect asset for you, right? Because you have to invest all this capital on behalf of your other investors. And your big thing is you need to break even nominally, right? So nominal versus real, right? Um, if
Hmm.
if I have $100 investment and I break even on the $100, but $100 is worth less, that's a nominal return, but not a real return, right? Um,
Hmm.
but these investors need a nominal return. And so you go along to these investors and you say, okay, Mr. Investor, you don't want to buy $1 million of this paper derivative of the house. What if we offered you a structured product, a principal protected note, where you get it's one security, it's one asset, but in that asset it is 90% it is 90% this paper, and it's 10% fire insurance. And so basically, you know that you're going to break even on your initial investment. You're going to have a nominal flat return, but you at least have the upside of this other thing. And so what that means, back to the bonds, metaphor aside, is that the U.S. government would be able to go to investors and say, okay, here is this structured product, whatever. 80% of the capital is going to U.S. bonds, and then the other 20% is we're going to take and we're going to buy Bitcoin for the treasure sheet, right? It's basically what Michael Saylor, again, back to MicroStrategy, what Michael Saylor's doing. What he's doing with convertible notes and MicroStrategy, this would be the comparable to that, right? The investor, and Michael Saylor, I forget the quote exactly, but he said, if the ducks are quacking, feed the ducks, right? Meaning investors in Wall Street can't buy Bitcoin right now, but what they can buy is they can buy convertible notes on the debt of MicroStrategy to get proxy Bitcoin exposure. And they're willing to pay
Hmm.
stupid low interest rates because they need to break even nominally, but they still get the upside of Bitcoin price appreciation, right? They don't get self custody Bitcoin, which, of course, for the average everyday person watching this, please do not accept that counterparty risk. But these institutions can't do that, right? And so my point is that I think that is the way at which large nations, I'm mostly talking about America here, will adopt Bitcoin. If I'm a person in the government, I need investors to be buying our bonds. And the best way for us to do that is to make sure that like we need to move more volume. We need to sell billions of dollars more bonds, but they don't want the paper. They want some sort of conglomeration between paper and real assets, right? So let's say $1 million investment instead of going to bonds alone goes to this structured product, this principal protected note, meaning okay, you're gonna put in $1 million, not let's say 800,000 of that is going to go to a treasury. That treasury is going to pay 5%, 6% a year, whatever, so that in the course of the duration of this bond, let's say maybe 10 years, you are going to break even, right? But backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, you are at least going to break even. But the other 20% is going to Bitcoin, and then you get that too. And so basically what that means is that it would be a brand new excuse for the US to just create as many bonds as they want, right? Because then if I'm an investor, it's like, okay, like why would I accept the risk of this other thing when at least I get the Bitcoin? And it's like it's a slow Trojan horsing of both
Hmm.
worlds where you satisfy the fiat demand to issue more bonds. The government's happy because they're stacking more Bitcoin by all these investors buying this paper security or product you're able to offer. The investors are happy because they feel a little more comfortable because they're getting some other exposure other than just fiat exposure. And
Right.
of course the other alternate is just they just print currency for Bitcoin, right? Like inflation is, let's say, 3%. Like, okay, let's just add another 0.5% to our inflation, use that money to buy Bitcoin. Yeah, we might lose a little bit of demand for our currency because our inflation rate is now 0.5% higher, but the perceived net
Hmm.
benefit in having a Bitcoin balance sheet is going to be worth it, right? Again, this is the Michael
Right.
Thaler MicroStrategy story, is that his company is way more in debt today than they were back in 2014. Their amount of debt has exploded. And actually their cost basis for Bitcoin is not nearly as low as some people think, right? Their cost basis is I think like $39,000, $40,000. It's like
Hmm.
MicroStrategy stock. Okay, and this is really important for those that don't quite follow what I'm saying or understand the game theory. MicroStrategy stock is up 1,200% in the last not even 10 years. Their stock is up 1,200%, but their Bitcoin cost basis is only up by about 60 or 65%, right? And that's what people haven't really priced in. All of the excess is fiat premium that has gone back to the stock. And so even though they have diluted their company, they've diluted their paper so much, the net benefit has been so much greater that it doesn't matter, right? So
Hmm.
as far as the game theory,
Hmm.
I think this is what the government's going to do is basically everyone's calling bluff and thinks our house is going to burn down. Let's inject a small portion of fire insurance to the rest of this, and we'll give it to investors that can't or don't want to buy only fire insurance. We'll give this to them because everyone else is still selling their own, house, right? If the world is a neighborhood, you have 10 different countries, each one with their own individual house. All of them have arsons. It's like if you're the one house on the block that's offering paper to your house, but 10, 15, 20% of your paper is fire insurance, like even though your house is still burning down, it's going to be the one house that still has any monetary premium to it compared to all the other houses, which again means it's far more likely the 10 firefighters in this theoretical neighborhood all come to you,
Right.
try to save your house, and therefore it's an inverse feedback loop back up. The more they come to your house,
Feedback loop up.
right, the less you need the fire insurance, but the more your paper is valuable, and then everyone all does the same. So anyway, that's kind of
Hmm.
how I would try to explain it as simply as I could. It's basically,
That's helpful for me.
yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's sound. And knowing that some of the guys that you work with at TBA are feeling that, and like think that's most likely, is super interesting. I also have heard similar rumblings. So you and I have to keep in touch as we see these things unfold. This is like the minutia of how these financial instruments work is fascinating to me, and I'm not an expert yet.
My name is Luke, and I'm a board member as well as the director of content at the 501c3 nonprofit organization Bitcoin is Better. The mission of Bitcoin is Better is to help the working class as well as people new to Bitcoin better understand Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? How does it work? And why is it important to me and my family? If you find this conversation interesting and you want to learn more about Bitcoin, please go to the website Bitcoin is Better, where you can get hours of free educational resources about Bitcoin as well as numerous articles about Bitcoin. Additionally, if you want to go even further and you're somebody that's new to Bitcoin or pretty curious about getting into Bitcoin, please fill out the application, the link of which is in the description below, where you can apply to join the show as a guest. Have a one-on-one discussion with somebody that can hopefully answer your questions about Bitcoin appropriately. And at the end of the conversation, you will get free Bitcoin as a thank you for your time, your interest, and engagement, and hopefully to propel you on your next steps in your Bitcoin journey. If you are not somebody that is new to Bitcoin, but you've been in Bitcoin a while, still liking and subscribing to this channel and sending these videos to your friends and people new to Bitcoin is something you can do to help the organization. And beyond that, please consider donating. Again, Bitcoin is Better is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Feel free to donate to us, and just a mere couple $100 donation will have a very lasting impact with lots of people new to Bitcoin that impacts many individuals and therefore many families. So please consider sharing this content with people that are new to Bitcoin in your network. Please consider donating so that Bitcoin could be passed on to new orange-pilled people right after a Bitcoin discussion with them. And additionally, beyond that, with the application, again, link in the description below, feel free to have people that you know in your network apply and join. And hopefully these kinds of conversations will be helpful to them as well as many, many viewers to come. Additionally, and finally, if you are new to Bitcoin or been in Bitcoin a while and you want specific support for yourself, one-on-one support, I'm happy to help you, whether it's buying Bitcoin for the first time,
buying Bitcoin for the 100th time, taking self-custody, upgrading your Bitcoin tax and legal status, whatever the case, if you need help with Bitcoin, no matter your skill level and no matter how much you're interested in buying, please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to help. So thank you for your time. Let's get back to the content. But we appreciate you engaging with this content. We appreciate you filling out the application to get free Bitcoin. We appreciate you checking out our free resources, and ultimately, if you feel called, to donate to our mission and our cause to accelerate Bitcoin adoption for the working class and to the majority of the world population, which is yet to acquire their first Bitcoin. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
So, everyone, appreciate you listening to our ramblings and our musings. But the long story short of this hour and a half conversation now, and my hope for everyone watching this, I think Jake's hope too, is to understand that Bitcoin is both an optimistic and a pessimistic worldview. We are pessimistic on arbitrary fiat, human index money management, right? We're very pessimistic on that. And so the beauty of Bitcoin is that it can replace that. And the irony is that by the humans, with their made up magic numbers, embracing that and injecting it into that system is probably what's going to extend the life of that fiat system as long as they can possible. And hopefully we have the minimal amount of suffering in this transition away from ancient monetary systems into a new, more modern monetary system. So that's the hope with Bitcoin. And that means that it's going probably to millions of dollars, if not tens of billions of dollars, if what we've said is true, not just from it's going up and you'll get rich, but also as it's going to protect you, right? The best way to protect against the debasement and inflation of the dollar is to own something that's going to go up in terms of dollars, right? So Bitcoin is this kind of magical insurance policy to protect you. And the upside of that, you could look either way, either the optimistic, I'll get rich, or the pessimistic, I don't have another option, right? Even if Bitcoin didn't make you any richer at all, you don't really have another option because the house is going to burn down either way, right? So I guess my final little metaphor there is like a Manhattan, right? So we've been talking about history a good bit, or at least I've been rambling about it. To use an example of Manhattan, right? People say Bitcoin is digital Manhattan, cyber Manhattan, whatever. And if you do the ratio between the two, we're in about the year 1630 to 1640 of Manhattan. We're still called New Amsterdam, about 20 years away from us shifting over to more British rule. And I say that because 8 billion people, 1 million Bitcoiners, 8 million people in Manhattan today. That's roughly about 10,000 for the equivalent level. That was about the 1630s or 40s. And all that to say is that by buying a piece of real estate in downtown Manhattan, you are an optimist because you are assuming that this island eventually is going to be fully occupied and people are going to build and your land's going to be worth a lot. But also simultaneously, you're protecting yourselves against the Dutch, which is where you come from because you're probably Dutch if you're in Manhattan in 1630. You're protecting against the Dutch debasing their bonds, which you don't know it yet, but they're going to do in about 15 years, right? So that is how early we are to Bitcoin. And that is why buying this digital Manhattan is both this optimistic and pessimistic trade. You get all the benefits of future human productivity, of the Empire State Building, of downtown Manhattan, of subways and planes and airports and everything in the world, including these crazy digital technologies you can't even begin to imagine, right? You get all the upside while protecting yourself against the political currency downside of a monetary empire across the Atlantic. So anyway, that's how I view Bitcoin. And that's very exciting. And I know, Jake, it's very exciting to you, and we talk a lot about this, but I know that you don't rest all of your hope on Bitcoin. I know that Bitcoin is really important and meaningful to both of us, Jake, because it's hopefully going to be a tool that's going to save millions of lives, prevent millions of deaths. But Jake, what would you say to somebody that is trying to figure out like hope beyond how to preserve my purchasing power in this life?
Great segue. One of the things that people say in Bitcoin all the time is fix the money, fix the world. And Bitcoin does fix a lot of things. But at the end of the day, man, like someday, Lord willing, I have a kid, she gets leukemia at age 12. Bitcoin ain't going to fix that. It's not going to protect her from that. Or I lose my job when I'm 40 and ain't going to protect me from that. Or, my wife gets hit by a bus when I'm 1 year into marriage or something. Like the world is already inherently fallen in ways that Bitcoin will never fix. Even like my own heart, I got all these issues, you know. As a Christian, I call that sin. I'm a proud man, you know. I'm greedy and lustful and selfish, and there's this yuck there that's a real burden for me. It just sucks, and I hate that, right? It's a burden, it's a heavy thing. Bitcoin is never going to fix that for me. And it's someday I'm going to die, and then Bitcoin's worth nothing to me, right? In the same way that, like, relative to fiat currency, you know, we're looking from Bitcoin's perspective, US dollars look like monopoly money. But as soon as we're all gone, Bitcoin looks like monopoly money too. And it serves me at none, zero. You know, it'll help my kids who are left behind with it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But so then all what I have left to hope for,
Yeah.
it's only Christ. Now we can talk more about that, but
Yeah.
it looks like you got something
No,
to
I
say.
was going to say, because all wealth is priced against future ability to survive. So if you die, there's no more future. Right?
Mhm.
It all comes back to
Right.
that, you know, and yeah, you're exactly right. That, you know, like you could have 100 Bitcoin, but if you're going to die tomorrow, like,
It's worth nothing to you.
yeah, it's like people will be so focused on their stacking goal, whether that's a tenth of a Bitcoin or 12 Bitcoin or 3 Bitcoin or 6.15 Bitcoin. It's like people would be so focused on that stack, but it's like if I gave the option of 100 Bitcoin and you're going to die with your keys tomorrow, like, which would you take? Probably the day. So then, is every day worth 100 Bitcoin to you? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But anyway.
Yeah.
So okay, so why?
Something I wanted.
No, go ahead.
You go.
No, so I was gonna ask why Christ? Like why not? Like why not your own worldview? Like why default?
Well,
why
I
default
tried
to that?
that. I tried that. I was just thinking about this morning. What would have happened to me if I would have found Bitcoin before Christ? And that's a scary thought for me because before I got saved when I was like 20, 21, and at that time, even as a young man, I was striving to build an empire to justify my own existence. And deep in my bones, I knew and felt that my existence wasn't justified, that I was worthless. And I was just aware of that scum and like a molecular level, and I probably couldn't have articulated it, and I certainly didn't want to admit it to anyone. In fact, I would claim the obvious, right? I was arrogant and proud, but deep underneath all of that was that like droning sense. And because I was trying to build the empire to prove myself, justify my existence, I got good at it because I tried hard. So even as a young man, there was a lot of success. And then eventually it crashed around me. And I can remember for like 6 months, literally 6 months, laying on the floor of my apartment all by myself, crying every night because I was faced with like a fork in the road between either I rebuild this whole thing, which I know is a front. It's all a facade to try to look cool and like myself and make other people like me, or I actually let this be the death that I know that is inevitable eventually and submit my whole life to Christ and not try to save myself. And it took me literally that long to finally agree to it. And it was like I was dying a slow death. On the other side of that death was all the freedom in the world. It was everything I ever needed. My soul was just like washed clean, and all of this like striving almost entirely ceased. It was like it reinvented me. But it's like jumping off a cliff. You don't think it's what you want to do until you do it, and then you realize the freedom that's in Christ's arms. But here's the thing: if I would have found Bitcoin before that, like it would have like made me so much more confident in my ability to succeed. I would have been a richer man. I would have felt like a smarter man. It would have like enabled even more of all that crap. It's just ugly and worthless, and it scares me to think about that.
No.
So I'm curious. This is one of the things I wanted to ask you in this call. If you've ever thought about that before, and how like the sequence of these journeys affected you.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. That's my biggest fear. Like I always say, I think we have less in common with the near future and the past. And I think Bitcoin has a wildly optimistic technological future for the world, because all of human history so far has been on these cycles. Like, we have had dozens of iterations, cycles, repeats. We have a new monetary empire, it falls. We have a new system of rules, it falls. We have a new game we all follow by, it falls, right? We have a new abstraction to represent the commodities we produce, and it falls, right? Again, again, again. And it's getting faster as we progress. But despite that, despite every few generations, we reset, build again, reset, build again. Despite that, we have still built so much. We still have these things. We have so much power at our fingertips, right? We still have these things despite that. And so, again, ironically, kind of like how Bitcoin to me is both optimism and pessimism. Yeah, I just accidentally turned on my flashlight. That's how much power we have. I didn't even intentionally lit a flashlight. Someone 1,000 years ago couldn't imagine doing that. Anyway, just like how Bitcoin itself is an optimism trade and a pessimism trade, I think Bitcoin, in the light of what you're saying with faith, is optimistic and pessimistic, right? Bitcoin is optimistic because what is one of the primary ways I think that the enemy destroys people? I think one of the main ways is distraction, is distraction from the truth, right? If you can't force a person to abandon the truth by telling them a lie, you can force them to abandon the truth by distracting them for their entire life until they die, right? Like that, I think, is a very often way the enemy causes people to live their whole life not living for the truth, is by giving them their whole life a carrot that they can perpetually run to, right? Kind of like what you're saying, building that empire in your case, right? And for me, it was other things too. And so I think the irony with Bitcoin, and what to me the most optimistic thing in all of Bitcoin, is that I talk to so many people that say they're coming to Christ, they're thinking more about their life, they're wanting to spend more time with their children, they're wanting to take care of their weight, they're wanting to do things because before they had this angst and stress because they didn't, their time horizon was so short. And so to me, the most optimistic thing in all of Bitcoin is I see more people now, they're more left alone with their thoughts. They have time to think, because instead of worrying about retiring at 70, now they can retire at the age of 45. They have so much more time that really starves the beast from being able to distract them for their whole life. So that's the most optimistic thing. And I hope that continues as Bitcoin skyrockets in adoption. But the most pessimistic thing to me in all Bitcoin is that Americans aren't necessarily, in a spiritual sense, better off than people that are starving elsewhere in the world, right? I've met a lot.
Potentially worse off.
Yeah, potentially worse. There could be an argument for that, right? It's really an individual by individual case, but more wealth does not necessarily mean more are saved. More wealth does not necessarily mean that more are pursuing truth. More wealth does not necessarily mean that people are even happier, right?
I mean, Christ says, harder for a rich man to get into heaven than through an eye of a needle.
Right. Exactly. And so
it makes it harder, dude.
Yeah, it sure does. And so I think that is, again, optimism, pessimism. I think Bitcoin is going to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, because I'm an optimist. Bitcoin is the global index for human productivity. And also because I'm a pessimist, I think that dollars are trending to zero forever, and Bitcoin is fire insurance on those dollars. It's one and the same. And likewise with Bitcoin, this is something I wrestled with for a while. It's like, should I, thinking to myself, should I pursue this Bitcoin thing? Should I start talking about it? Should I start talking about it as a Christian, right? Thinking about these things, praying about them, whatever. Ultimately, I just threw my hands up and I said, God, I don't know, but I know this is a movement that's going to accelerate rapidly, right? This is the largest political movement in human history, if not, even though it's an apolitical movement, it's still a movement, right? It's apolitical, which means it's political, it's complicated, but
Sure.
I believe more and more people are going to adopt this technology, like, it doesn't matter if I like it or not. It's just what's going to happen. God has allowed it to happen, so I can't change that. But the only thing I know to do is to talk about it in hopes that hopefully as Bitcoin continues to help people buy back their time, hopefully we can steward people towards looking at themselves in the mirror and realizing their need for a savior. And hopefully less people will go towards a world where now, because we have so much prosperity, we can be entertained forever, right? Like in the same way that the burden of political currency being removed from stealing people's time is a benefit for helping people buy their time back. Technological progress helps people have the option to be entertained or pacified, is probably a better word, for the rest of their life, right? You don't find people in Congo or people in Venezuela, on their phone for 16 hours a day watching TikToks, right? That being pacified their whole life, right? Or whatever, pick your vice of choice. But so yeah, I love your answer, because I wrestle with that too, right? Is finding Bitcoin before Christ good or bad? I don't know, but I think at the end of the day, I think there's a very bullish case to say that Bitcoin could bring, and not that Bitcoin brings anyone to salvation, right? Obviously, but Bitcoin as a worldview can help change people's minds. Eventually, help some realize that
Yeah.
they've been called or whatever, right? And so I think
Right.
I
In the
think
same
there's
way
both
that
points of the
college,
argument.
yeah, in the same way that going to college sort of like opens up your worldview,
Yeah.
the Bitcoin rabbit hole actually has a similar effect on people.
Right.
At least some of the time. It's like, wow, there's a lot I didn't
Yeah.
know about the world. I'm reassessing my whole framework, and now my mind is open to these sorts of questions. I definitely agree with that.
Right. Yeah.
But for the believer, it is and I think every believer knows this intuitively. This, like, the spirit in them is like, be cautious, my son.
Yeah.
This is it's a dangerous tool. In the hands of the right good doctor, it's an effective scalpel, but in the hands of a fool, that's a rusty sword.
Right.
That could cause some real damage.
Yeah.
And so if anyone's listening to this and they have apprehensions about Bitcoin because it feels like get rich quick or anything like that, yeah, it can be that.
It can be
There's
that.
a lot of people who've fallen victim to that. But the reality is, the technology agnostically is just a just unit of account for human time and energy. Full stop. And as a Christian, we love that, because it's a form of justice in the world that we're called to steward. But we always keep in mind, we ain't going to be here forever. So my hope ain't in Bitcoin.
Right.
Hope is in the Lord. And I love that Bitcoin is helping us to steward the world that we're in now while we're here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's my call to Christians to get more involved with Bitcoin, because if this is going to be a massive technology and political worldview paradigm, I think it's really important Christians partake in that and share in that, because it's like, if you take a small child and give them fame and money, it's like, if you don't give them guidance, not that I'm saying I have guidance or we have guidance, but Christ is ultimate guidance. But anyway, so I think it's optimistic and pessimistic. I really think Bitcoin could save millions of lives, or at least extend the lifespan of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. And my hope is that some percentage of them will begin pursuing truth in this life and find ultimate truth beyond, in that extra time that Bitcoin helps give them. But at the end of the day, as more and more people become Americans and less people become starving, will that mean that we also build our new kind of Tower of Babel internally in our heart? And it's so anyway, I don't know if Bitcoin is going to net out, quote unquote, more or less Christians, but I do know that it's probably happening whether we like it or not. And I do know that God called us to love the poor and help people. And I think the fastest way to help as many poor people around the world as possible is to accelerate an economic incentive structure that that allows for less poverty. So anyway, I guess that's my view of a Christian. And I guess to your point at the very end of what you said there, I think the irony is that a lot of people in Bitcoin, everyone in Bitcoin, has to admit to themselves they are not worthy to be a monetary god, right? Like, I am not worthy to control the world's money supply. We have to have money be outside human control, dictated by math, by computers that work on entropy and by the laws of the universe that we don't know technically how to stop, right? That's Bitcoin. And so to me, a lot of Bitcoiners start thinking about Christ, start thinking about philosophy, religion, because admitting Bitcoin is better is inherently admitting I'm insufficient, I'm not a good person enough to control money, which then I think forces people to realize, if I'm not good enough to dictate my own form of money or the rest of the world's form of money, what makes me think I'm a good enough person to dictate who my moral authority is, right? Because that is the biggest reason people don't want to embrace Jesus, is because we all default back to Adam and Eve in the fall and say, I don't want God to be my moral authority where he writes the rules. I want to write the rules, and I think I'm a good person. But the way Bitcoin shatters that worldview in the monetary, very isolated monetary sense, and forcing people to realize, I'm not moral enough, I'm not good enough to resist the temptation to print more money, and therefore we need the system outside my control. They realize I'm not worthy to excuse my own errors. I'm not worthy enough to pay the dues, pay the debts, or justify my own shortcomings, sins, failures, and transgressions on others, right? And so, anyway, I think I'm glad we wrapped up on this point, because I think that's the beauty of Jesus, is when people realize that the best solution to a great tool to starve an institution of sin run by humans is an apolitical solution, which is Bitcoin, but that doesn't solve the human heart, right? And by helping people realize the institution is corrupt and that any other institution filled by humans, including themselves, would also be corrupt, then they realize, wait a second, if all humans are corrupt, including me, and I stop deceiving myself and telling myself that I'm a good enough person, quote unquote, then we can start to have the conversation about who is worthy to say that you've been justified. So, anyway.
Right on. Well, thanks for your time, Luke.
Yeah, thank you.
I gotta bounce.
Yeah, I know we gotta go, but
this was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, appreciate Jake, everyone watching. Hope at least something in here was interesting. Hopefully, a lot of it. So, thank everyone for your time. Thank you, Jake. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Luke. Take care, everyone.